All right, ditch those dusty textbooks because we're going deep on the Pilgrims. And trust me, it's way more exciting than you probably think.
We've got a Journal of the Pilgrims at Plymouth. It's first-hand accounts, edited by Dwight B. Heath. And let me tell you, this is not your typical Thanksgiving story.
This journal is seriously packed with detail. You feel like you're right there with them. But okay, before we get into all that, let's set the scene. Most of us picture the Pilgrims landing on this untouched wilderness at Plymouth Rock, but that wasn't exactly the case, right?
Not exactly. Don't forget, European explorers had already been all over the New England coast. They even had maps. Plymouth Harbor was already charted, called Port du Cap de St. Louis by Samuel de Champlain. That was years before the Pilgrims even left.
So maybe not completely uncharted, but it was still a risky move, right? I mean, packing up your entire life, crossing an ocean with your family, heading into who knows what, that takes some serious guts.
Oh, absolutely. And it's even more interesting when you think about what they were worried about. The journal mentions they were actually scared of a mutiny.
A mutiny. Whoa, okay, now that's some drama. What was going on?
Well, see, not all the passengers were those hardcore pilgrims, the ones from Leiden. Some were just people, recruited by the merchant adventurers who were paying for the trip. And these strangers, that's what the pilgrims call them, they weren't all about the religious stuff.
So you've got this whole mix of people stuck on a tiny ship for months. Yeah, I can see how things could get tense.
Exactly. And on top of that, they didn't actually have a legal right to settle in New England. For the Pilgrims, this was a huge problem. They thought they were on, like, a mission from God, starting this community God chose. Without that legal document, their whole purpose, not just the law part of it, was in question.
Wow, so they're dealing with rough seas, no space, running out of food, and now the spiritual crisis. No wonder they were on edge.
So to deal with all this, they did something pretty bold. They wrote up the Mayflower Compact. It set up a way to govern themselves, to keep things in order, despite everything going on. It's actually a really big moment because it kind of lays the foundation for self-governance that shaped America.
And think about it, they're figuring this incredibly important document out while they're crammed together, probably seasick, trying to survive the Atlantic. The journal says people were sleeping in a partially taken apart boat just to have some room.
It was rough, man. The fact they not only survived, but also planned out their future society shows how determined they were.
Okay, so they finally land, step onto, Plymouth Rock, and then they have their first encounters with the Native Americans. I bet that was intense.
You got to remember, the Pilgrims had these ideas about Native Americans from stories about other colonies, stories of fighting. But what they found was, well, a lot more complicated.
Okay, I'm listening. What did they find?
They found evidence of a whole society, a palisade, houses, buried corn, even graves. These weren't just people wandering around. They had roots, a history, a culture that was here long before the Mayflower.
I can imagine how curious, but also nervous they must have felt. And then there's that first encounter with the Nausetts. The journal really makes you feel it. The fear, everyone grabbing weapons, the noise of the fight.
Yeah, it was a big moment. The Pilgrims, already kind of freaked out, come across these Nausetts. And let's be real, they were both terrified. Arrows flying, muskets firing. It really shows that this new world wasn't empty and that dealing with the indigenous people wasn't going to be easy.
It wasn't just fighting, though, was it? The journal also talks about all the natural resources the Pilgrims found.
Just imagine landing in a place with resources you've never even seen before. Flocks of geese and ducks everywhere, fish practically jumping into your boat, whales right by the ship. They even had a pretty funny encounter with a whale. Almost shot it.
Wait, they tried to shoot a whale?
One story says this whale's just hanging out near the ship, and some of the guys, maybe showing off or just curious, decide to shoot at it. But their musket, backfires, scares everyone half to death, and the whale swims off totally fine.
Whoa, that was close. So they're figuring out this new place, dealing with all this worry, seeing crazy wildlife, but they still had to decide where to live. The journal talks about them debating over the best spot.
They were seriously picky about it, thinking about how deep the harbor was, if the soil was good for growing things, how close it was to good fishing spots. This wasn't just about picking a pretty view, it was about survival. Plus, remember, they had investors back in England, the merchant adventurers, who were expecting them to make good on their money.
Yeah, so finding a good location wasn't just about being comfortable, it was about proving this whole thing was worth it. So what made Plymouth the winner?
Well, according to the journal, Plymouth had a decent harbor, good corn ground, which meant the soil was good, and it was close to Cape Cod where they'd seen those whales. They figured the fishing would be great there. Plus, and this is the kind of sad part, the people who lived there before had died from a sickness. meaning left chance of fighting right away.
Yeah, that's a dark side to it all. So even with a good spot, life in Plymouth was still pretty tough, right?
Oh, yeah. Forget those cozy Thanksgiving pictures. Their first Christmas, they were building houses, not having feasts. They were constantly fighting the weather, running low on supplies, getting sick, and always worried about fires.
So not a walk in the park then.
Not at all. They had to adapt, get creative, and really rely on their own skills just to get by. They built their own houses, cleared land for planting, and were always looking for ways to survive.
It sounds like a real test.
Absolutely. And we're really just getting started with their story. The journal goes on to talk about how resourceful they were, how their relationship with the Native Americans changed, and how they adjusted to this whole new world.
Okay, so we've got these pilgrims, up against the weather, building their homes, trying to make it in this completely new world. But they weren't exactly living off the land like, experts, were they?
Not right away. I mean, you got to remember, these were people used to a totally different life. They were learning on the fly, really depending on natural resources, but also, and this is important, on the Native Americans, their knowledge and how willing they were to help.
Yeah, that makes sense. They wouldn't have made it very long without knowing how things worked around there.
Exactly. The journal goes into a lot of detail about what they relied on: fish, wild plants, and you can't forget Indian corn, which they learned to grow from Squanto.
Ah, Squanto. Practically a Thanksgiving legend, right? But I bet there's a lot more to his story than we usually hear about.
Oh yeah, for sure. The journal tells a much bigger story. Squanto wasn't just a helpful Native American guy who happened to know English. He was Patuxet, kidnapped by an English captain, a guy named Hunt, and sold into slavery in Europe.
Wow, you don't hear that part in those Thanksgiving plays. It's a real reminder of, the bad side of European
Uh,
colonialism.
It's a big deal because it shows how complicated things were between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. Here's this man who's been through the worst of the English, and then, because he learned English while he was captive, he ends up being the one who helps them survive.
It's kind of ironic, right? Like the victim of their own people becomes their lifeline in this whole new place.
It says a lot about Squanto, how tough he was, how he could adapt and deal with these crazy situations. And it shows that the Pilgrims, they only succeeded because they had the Native Americans, their knowledge, and their cooperation.
That's a good point. It challenges that whole idea we have of pilgrims as like tough guys conquering everything on their own.
Exactly. They needed the indigenous people, especially in those first years.
And speaking of working together, the journal mentions this big meeting with Massasoit, the paramount sachem, basically the leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy.
Yeah, that meeting was huge for Plymouth in those early days. It wasn't just a casual, hey, nice to meet you thing. The journal talks about a whole ceremony, gifts being exchanged, them working out a peace treaty.
Okay.
It even mentions Massasoit being shocked that the English king didn't have a wife.
Hold on, a king with no wife. What was so strange about that to him?
It shows how different their cultures were. The Wampanoag, so connected to the land with their own complex society, probably couldn't understand a place where a leader didn't have a strong woman by his side.
That's so interesting. It makes you realize how much our own cultures shape how we see power and who's in charge.
Absolutely. This wasn't just two groups meeting. It was like two totally different ways of seeing the world coming together. But even with those differences, they managed to agree on things. They made an alliance that was super important for both of them if they wanted to survive.
So this treaty wasn't just about, being friendly neighbors. It was about both sides needing each other.
For sure. For the Pilgrims, it meant safety, being able to get resources, a chance to build their colony without being attacked all the time. For Massasoit, it could mean protection from other tribes, like the Narragansetts. It was a practical thing, born out of necessity, and it really shaped what happened to both the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims.
This journal doesn't just focus on the politics, though. It also gives us these amazing looks into everyday life for both the Pilgrims and the Native Americans.
And that's what really makes it come alive. It takes us past the dates and names and puts us right there with them. We get details about their homes, their food, what games they played, the clothes they wore. We see things through their eyes, and that's when things start to make sense.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell us some of those details. What kind of things did they notice about each other?
For example, the Pilgrims were super detailed about the Wampanoag homes, how they were made from young trees bent into a circle and covered with these thick woven mats. They talk about the fire in the middle, the sleeping mats around it, all the tools they used every day. It's so clear you can almost smell the smoke from the fire and hear what they were doing.
Like time travel with words. What about the Pilgrims? What details do we get about how they lived day to day?
The journal talks about the hard work of building those houses, often when it was freezing or raining, and how much they relied on their shipbuilding skills, not just to fish, but to trade and get around. They even talk about their common house burning down by accident. That shows how dangerous fire was and how hard things were in those early days.
It's amazing how these little details suddenly make history seem so real, so relatable. It's not just history anymore. It's like we're there with them.
Exactly. We see them being clever, struggling, being tough, and just being human. It reminds us that these weren't just names in a book. They were real people dealing with crazy stuff, building a new world, and leaving their mark on history.
This deep dive has really changed how I think about the Pilgrims and their whole story. There's so much more to it than the simple version we usually hear.
And there's still so much more to learn about. We haven't even gotten into what happened later on for the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. That's another whole discussion. But for now, let's just appreciate how much this amazing firsthand account tells us.
I gotta say, I thought I knew the Pilgrim story, the basics. But wow, was I wrong? This journal has been a total game changer.
It really is amazing how these firsthand accounts can completely change how we see history, right?
Yeah.
It's not just dates and names anymore. It's about, well, what it was like to be them.
For sure. And what really stood out to me was how incredibly tough these people were, both the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, I mean. All the challenges they faced, like sailing across a crazy ocean and then figuring out how to live in a totally new place.
And don't forget the constant threat of disease and starvation
Yeah.
and conflict. It's pretty amazing they didn't just survive, but built a whole new society in this, well, pretty harsh place.
It wasn't just about being tough, though, right? Remember how the Pilgrims needed the Native Americans, like their knowledge and how willing they were to help, especially Squanto, I mean. It really shows how connected their stories are.
Yeah, that's so important. We usually hear this story about the Pilgrims as these lone heroes, conquering the wilderness all by themselves. But this journal, it shows the much more complicated story, one where they worked together, shared their cultures, and needed each other.
Exactly. And it makes you think, without that help from the Native Americans, without someone like Squanto to, bridge the gap between them, would the Pilgrims have even made it through those first few years?
That's a really interesting question, and it also makes you think about, well, what happened after those early years? The journal only covers the beginning, but we know the story goes on, right, for both the Pilgrims and the Native Americans.
That's what makes this so fascinating. We're not just like busting myths. We're seeing how complex and connected history actually is.
Yeah, and how those early encounters, those first agreements they made, those first steps into this new world, they had consequences that lasted for, well, a really long time.
It's a lot to think about. Honestly, it's made me even more curious about this whole thing. Definitely adding some books to my to-read list.
Me too. There's always something new to learn, more to discover. That's what's so great about history. It's an endless journey.
Well, on that note, a huge thank you to you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's inspired you to, go beyond those textbooks and check out some of these amazing firsthand accounts.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It helps us understand the present and even shape the future.
Until next time, keep digging deeper, keep asking those questions, and keep exploring those stories that connect us all.